we would like to take a moment to recognize our friends at Tech Manitoba for their support today. With the move to advanced manufacturing, more automation, AI, cybersecurity, and more, it is more critical than ever for manufacturing and tech to align. We are proud to partner with Tech Manitoba as we face the future of manufacturing. And on to our next session. Have you noticed it's hard to find subject matter experts who have taken time to understand our industry and what makes us unique? Well, we are so excited to bring you our next two presenters, two individuals who are experts in civility, who have done a deep dive into civility in manufacturing. With 20 years in the workforce, Christian Masadi, recognized internationally as a leading expert on civility as continuous improvement, understands that being civil and humane is a critical leadership competency that not only builds trust and credibility, but also impacts bottom line metrics, including safety, quality, delivery, engagement, and efficiency. Many people perceive having respect, exhibiting kindness, and treating people well as a sign of weakness. But according to Christian, who partnered with civility expert CEO Dr. Loena Baer to write the award-winning Manufacturing Civility, undervaluing the human aspect of business is a costly mistake because civility is a continuous improvement strategy for managing the people side of manufacturing. For more than 20 years, Dr. Loena Baer has been internationally recognized as the leading expert in civility at work. With a focus on social intelligence and culturally competent communication, the team at Civility Experts, which includes over 500 affiliates in 48 countries, has supported hundreds of organizations in building better workplaces. Christian, over to you. I think you're on mute. There we go.
Hello, hi. I think Lou's going to introduce everyone and start.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. I'm Dr. Lou Baer, and it's my distinct pleasure today. I want to thank CME and Women in Manufacturing for this opportunity, and it's a privilege as well for me to present with my colleague and co-author on 3 books geared specifically to civility in manufacturing, Christian Masadi, who you'll hear from shortly. You may not know that a recent Gallup State of the American Workplace report found that 75% of manufacturing employees are disengaged. In fact, the manufacturing sector was the least engaged across all sectors. And this is disengagement, of course, is costly and alarming no matter what sector you're in, but a closer look at the research about disengagement in manufacturing showed that the primary cause of this disengagement is leadership. Specifically, supervisors and managers with low social acuity are co-creating uncivil workplace cultures. And Christian's going to get into social acuity a little bit, but that's an aspect of social competence. And this is important to understand because research out of Harvard University says that 80% of our long-term success in life and in work, and particularly in leadership situations, is a result of our social competence. So social acuity, as I mentioned, will come up again in our session. In addition, the research shows that incivility has measurable impacts to our health. And this is an interesting insight as well. The CDC stated that by 2020, which of course we're just into 2021 now, so this is certainly relevant, by 2020, depression that they attribute to stress at work, which is attributed largely to incivility at work, would be the second leading cause, second only to ischemic heart disease, for disability at work. The estimates are that 7 out of 10 working adults will experience some measure of depression, again, tied to stress, which is tied to incivility. And this is important for you as leaders in your field because leaders impact the overall experience in the workplace, and they, in fact, can have some control over those stress factors which cause the depression, which is a very costly health issue for any workplace in any sector. In addition, and the good news is, research from Weber Shadwick shows that organizations that incorporate civility into their values, their policies, their procedures, and their best practices experience, on average, 30% increases in engagement, up to 4 times more retention, and an average of 30% more profitability. So there's a solid business case and impact to the bottom line. In our short time with you today, we're going to share with you the definition of civility so that you understand that it's a measurable competency and that you can immediately see its value for manufacturing. We're going to talk about how people treatment is continuous improvement, and we're going to share some tools and resources. We'll be loading some of those in the chat box ongoing during the session today. Tools that you can use to start changing your workplace culture immediately. And as was mentioned in the introduction, we have the luxury today of Christian, who is the leading expert on civility and continuous improvement, who can share with you some of his practical, real-life experience related to this topic. On the screen here, we've provided for you an overview of continuous improvement strategy, and this is captured in its entirety, and we go into some depth in the Manufacturing Civility book. We can post a link to Amazon for that if you like. I did understand that we're giving away some of these books as well, Lean on Civility, some Civility at Work, which incorporates Christian's work, and also some social competence for supervisors in manufacturing as well. Generally, though, we wanted you to understand, you see the first box at the top of the chart, that there are processes that support civility. So when I talk about how the Weber-Shadwick research said organizations that incorporate civility into their workplace experience on average 30% more profitability as well as measurable gains in engagement and retention, part of the way they do that is by incorporating civility into the elements indicated in that first chart. So feedback and evaluation processes, recruitment and hiring processes, policies, safety aspects, reward and incentive pieces, and so forth. So once again, we might not be able to get into all of that today, but we wanted you to have an overview so you could at least formulate some questions if you'd like. Once we have a culture of civility embedded, there are 6 traits that are readily evident in terms of how the leadership interact, their attitudes, their demeanor, their overall philosophies and approach to people treatment. Those are character, courage, communication, competence, consistency, and change readiness. And lastly on the chart, you'll see there when we talk about how civility is measurable, some of the ways that you can measure the positive impacts of civility are by trust surveys, overall retention metrics, social capital, impacts to innovation, safety. We see dramatic impacts sometimes in terms of safety, workplace wellness, profitability, efficiency, and so on. So one of the reasons, although there's a solid business case, and sometimes organizations are aware of that, sometimes the reason people still don't incorporate civility as a best practice or as continuous improvement is because they don't understand what civility is. For example, if you were to Google civility or you pulled out the dictionary, Oxford Canadian, for example, you would see that civility is frequently defined as manners, that is about niceness, that is about following social rules. And all of those things matter. They are a small piece of civility, but for practical application, over our 25 years in the field, we have learned that you need to define civility for the context. And so we have devised with our 500 affiliates, and we use this definition in 48 countries. Government of Canada uses it now for National Occupational Standards for Civility Practitioners, which, by the way, the research is saying almost every organization by 2025 will have an aspect of civility practitioners, either a full-time civility practitioner or their HR will engage in aspects of civility practice by 2025. We also use this definition, the International Civility Trainers Consortium that certifies civility trainers uses this definition. So just so you can get a sense of it, it'll help you understand how civility, as Christian will explain to you, can be used as continuous improvement. Civility is a conscious awareness of your thoughts and actions, words, and intentions. So there's an aspect of being present when we talk about civility. It's not something that happens by accident. There's intention, and we're aware, conscious of what we're doing and thinking and saying. The second piece is a continuous acknowledgement of our responsibility. This is part of the human-kind notion related to civility, where just because we're human and on the planet, we acknowledge that each individual is deserving of respect, that it's not something that you need ever earn. And when you take on that attitude, you see that you can ease the experience of others through non-judgment, respect, restraint, common courtesies, and so forth. And there is an increase in personal responsibility, which in most workplaces transfers over to accountability. The last piece of our definition is about consistency. Civility has to be practiced such that it becomes a habit, that it becomes who you are, not just what you do. And when many individuals in a workplace attach civility as a personal core value, we see that it becomes part of the organizational character and culture as well. And that's a big part of our conversation today. Just to give you a little sense of when we talk about measurable competencies, you probably would have guessed that there are skills that people need to learn or be taught so that they can experience and exhibit civility. The 4 skills that underpin civility are systems thinking, continuous learning, cultural competence, and social intelligence. Social acuity, as I mentioned in the first slide, is one that there's been all kinds of validated research, in particular about the Harvard research being the most influential in our field. It was, again, that 80% of your long-term success in life and work, particularly if you're in a leadership role, is due to your social competence. The compass in the front end of the slide there reflects 4 conditions that, based on our 25 years of fieldwork, we have come to understand are critical and have to be in place before a change initiative will take hold. So the research says that 70% of change initiatives fail, and we know that most often there are 2 key factors that contribute to that failure. They are overall engagement. In our field, we relate that to trust. So if there's not a baseline level of trust among and across the work team, no amount of spectacular training is likely going to change behavior or be transferred for application in the workplace. And the second strongest indicator of whether or not a change initiative will take hold relates to overall change, meaning, as is happening in a lot of workplaces now with technology shifts due to COVID pandemic, we see change fatigue. And so frequently we're training for the sake of training, not to meet a specific need. We're adopting new policies and procedures ongoing at a rapid rate. We're expecting people to adapt to changes in personnel and to process and to systems and so on. And when there is a high level of change and change fatigue isn't monitored, again, no amount of even fantastic targeted training will take hold to the extent that we need it to. Our research also shows that there needs to be alignment, and this relates to messaging that is congruent across the work teams, starting from the top down. And this comes up a little bit later in Christian's comments about civility and communications. And the last piece of that compass relates to readiness. Readiness is about skill development. So, for example, if the leadership team are not skilled such that they can actually deliver the change behavior or the change processes, etc., if they cannot teach and mentor and coach, if they don't have those skills, they're lacking in skills, so we would call that low skill readiness. And readiness also relates to resources. So there has to be time and money set aside if you're going to try to incorporate any sort of change initiative. And as was indicated, civility in the workplace is a change initiative. Some of these things I want to emphasize, you don't have to fully understand what all of that means in order to be able to use the tools that we're going to share with you today. But we will upload in the chat box this graphic if you need it, and also a PDF copy of the full book. It's called 30% Solution, which captures all of that research I've been referencing and highlights in the various chapters some assessments related to these 4 core skills that underpin civility, and some general information about the business case for civility. And we find it applies across sectors, including manufacturing. So we'll load some of those extra resources for you in the chat box. And at this time, I'd like to pass things back now to Christian, who, with his 25 plus years in manufacturing, has experienced firsthand how civility impacts the bottom line, and he can chat a little bit about that for you. Thank you. Go ahead, Christian.
All right, thank you, Lou. Does civility impact the bottom line? When it comes to civility, incivility, everyone in the organizations is impacted in some ways. This becomes a problem worth solving in any organization, but in manufacturing, where the people on the production floor are the backbone of the business, it's imperative to solve the problem of incivility at work. One thing I want to say is that since 1999, I've been trying to explain the one factor that is rarely addressed when there is variability in manufacturing, and it's the variability of culture. We standardize equipment, we standardize tooling, we standardize processes, and almost everything else in the workplace, but we don't standardize people treatment. And people are variable, and we can't control everything, but we can manage people treatment to a large extent, and we can reduce the aspect of variability. And what I'm saying is variability causes unsafe practices and errors. So we work to reduce the variability through standard operating procedures. But to date, there hasn't been a standardized operating procedure for the people side of variability. If you want to assess the people side of variability, we can help with that. We do offer generalized assessments. For example, if you want to do a quick review of civility symptoms, you can find a symptoms survey under resources section on the civilityexperts.com website, or use the civility compass assessment that Lou just mentioned. And these tools can help you recognize that you have an incivility problem. What is workplace incivility? My experience has been that to identify incivility, you need to pay attention. Unlike harassment, which is usually overt and intended to cause harm, incivility is low intensity, deviant workplace behavior with an ambiguous intent. So you need to know the symptoms, and you need to watch for them. People are very rarely trained in this skill area, which for your interest is called social intelligence. Now, you can refer to data, for example, that costs are high, that there's increased safety issues, increased scrap, or high turnover, for example. But knowing these figures isn't enough to solve the problem. You need to ask, why are those things happening? And typically, the root cause we find is incivility. Now, think about your workforce and the questions when they're asked questions. Are they answering with things like, no one told me to do this, or I wasn't trained, or how was I supposed to know? Over the years, I have observed that if you listen, people tell you their problems and issues. You have to watch and listen. Some of the following are indicators that people have a problem or issue. Something like people withholding information, or persistent miscommunication, or a disregard for safety, or feigning injuries, and poor quality performance. It's difficult to evaluate qualitative information, and many people see aspects of workplace culture as qualitative. But we can quantify incivility, and you will see this with the civility continuum that we'll bring up shortly. And using this tool, you can in fact measure incivility as part of your usual KPIs, and you can collect data related to uncivil behavior. Using our tools, you can use your KPI data that already reflects incivility and reframe it in a quantitative way. For example, And while I'm talking, I really want to make specific examples of manufacturing and the experiences you're used to. So let's say a machine makes 60 units an hour. And if you load the machine properly and you supply the machine, it should make 60 units per hour, correct? So ideally with an 8-hour shift, you would make 480 units. And if there are no machine issues, but the machine only makes 450 units per day, then how do you explain that? And I relate that to experiences where you have team meetings or an end of production meeting and you can't explain the variability of why you lost production if all the processes were in place and all the machinery was working. So this variability and your loss of production is the people side of things that can explain this problem, but it's hard to quantify. You don't always have an answer of why you lost that production. So for example, a cultural events that happened while you lost production would be someone coming in late or an employee deliberately taking his time loading materials and other things. And these problems are culture problems related to people treatment or incivility. It is very common to have multiple shifts. I'm sure a lot of you have been in an experience where you've had multiple shifts. You have a night shift, a day shift, or even 3 shifts. And you'll find with the same processes and the same machinery that people don't always produce the same. Each shift is different. And then why is there a variance? So this is what people have difficulty explaining, and it's mainly due to culture. Now, you can use our tools to use quantitative data, for example, explaining the 30 units lost on that day. And we want to quantify the people aspects. Now, how many of you, and you can raise your electronic hand if this applies to you, have ever been told by your manager, and I hope you've had this experience and resolved it, or you've felt this experience before, and your manager tells you to go out there and we need to change the culture. And have you as a leader ever told your people to go out there and change the culture? My experience, countless times I was told to do these things, but no one ever told me how to do it. I don't know how to build trust, or I didn't know how to build trust. I didn't know how to build rapport, and I didn't know what an improvement should look like. What was the specific goal? What was our target in improving culture? So we define workplace culture as the daily experience of the people living in the workplace. So I understand after years in the field that changing culture means changing the daily experience of the people at work. Specifically, we want to reduce their stress, make their day positive, solve their problems, or as in the civility definition, ease their experience. Now, raise your hands again if you believe that when the majority of the leaders in manufacturing tell you to go out and change culture, what they're actually saying is take a more aggressive approach and get people to work harder and be held more accountable. In my opinion, these managers were not actually concerned about the experience of the people. And that is exactly why people disengage. They do not feel valued or trusted. They behave in uncivil ways. This is exactly why these workplace cultures rarely change. So is your leadership the problem? And leadership is often the problem. And the hard truth is that incivility starts at the top. The people who have control of the daily experience have to set the standard for people treatment. Now, let's look at this as a process familiar to most of you in manufacturing, and it is a value chain. And hope many of you seen work processes and value chains. So a value chain is defined as a business model that describes the full range of activities needed to create a product or a service. And in this case, we're going to provide both. In this case, we are creating a culture of civility. That is the end product. Positive people treatment and civil behaviors make up the service that each person living in the workplace experiences. Now, for the value chain to work, every leader, manager, and supervisor has to adopt civility as its core value. And then when leaders treat people well, because this is part of their character, we see an increase in civil behavior. And some of these behaviors are listed in the chart in the middle section you'll see. The examples are truth-telling, resilience, self-direction, and consistency. And we see that when leaders treat people well, these people in turn treat other coworkers well as their suppliers. When the entire work team exhibits and experiences civility, we see increases in positive people treatment impacts. Now, I just mentioned positive people treatment impacts, and I'd like Lou, if you could give us a little bit of information about the people treatment self-assessment.
Thank you. So for those of you who are just joining us, we'll ask Pam to load the social acuity survey, the people treatment self-assessment, that diagram of the civility value chain, and already in there is the 30% solution book, and we could probably load the Civility's continuous improvement process graphic as well, so that you have some reference materials if you missed those slides. Christian was just talking about the people treatment self-assessment. So in our field, we describe the behaviors, demeanor, and attitude that is exhibited by people for whom civility is a core value as positive people treatment. We've already highlighted that both the research and our field work suggest that in many organizations, leadership is primarily responsible for the workplace culture, and we've defined culture as the day-to-day experience of the people working in that organization. So what happens, unfortunately, is that, number one, leadership often overlooks civility as something of value because they don't understand what it is. You can guess, as we've suggested, that if you define civility as manners, or you perceive it as a nice-to-have kind of soft skill following social rules, it's going to be very hard to understand immediately how it impacts the bottom line. But the reality is, when you define civility as a measurable competency and you look at the behaviors we ask leaders to exhibit in the workplace, which should be positive, this measuring of positive people treatment behavior is an indicator usually of the overall values proposition. So this particular survey is something we would encourage every leader in the organization to take. It's a self-assessment. There are about 40 behaviors listed on the document, and if you were to review the document, you could very quickly see how many of those 40 behaviors you perceive yourself to exhibit in a consistent way every day in the workplace. I find it's interesting as well to have our coworkers assess us. If we have people we trust on our work team, the social acuity, the people treatment, and the civility symptoms survey, which we didn't provide for you today because you can get it at Civility Experts on the upper right-hand corner, that assessment. But if you were to ask your work team in leadership, including HR, maybe the plant manager, supervisors, union reps, managers, etc., to take these assessments, you could pretty quickly get a snapshot of the overall level of civility that's being exhibited on a daily basis. And when we understand that that behavior, the way people are treated, impacts how they in turn behave and how they treat others, then it's very easy to see how the influence can trickle down and how it needs to be positive versus negative. So the people treatment is a starting point. It takes about 10 minutes at most to do. If we discover that people treatment scores are low, then the next step would be to do a social intelligence test and a trust survey, and we provide all of those tools at no charge to organizations who are interested in doing that. So I hope that's helpful. Again, the PDF is in the chat box, and you can certainly download it. If you have questions about any of these assessments, or you would like some debriefing support, you can just email events@civilityexperts, and I'm happy to send you further documents or set up a time to chat with you about that. This next slide, we're going to ask Christian to come back and to describe now. This is an overview of the civility and practice model, which shows how precisely people treatment and other aspects of civility become a continuous learning strategy, continuous improvement. That does incorporate continuous learning, by the way, but a continuous improvement strategy for manufacturing workplaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. There are two things I want you to take away from this presentation, and this is the first. I want you to consider civility as a continuous improvement strategy, regardless of what you are currently doing for continuous improvement or how effective you think it has been. And let me say that most continuous improvement strategies that you may already have in place do work, but at what cost? So we don't want to replace your continuous improvement program. We want civility to work, coincide with your current continuous improvement program. So for example, continuous improvement is often implemented after a situation or a crisis or a problem occurs. And by that time, employees are already stressed or tired or not trusting leadership. And it's hard to work to solve a problem and make improvements under these conditions. So no change will be effective unless the conditions support it. So if you need a culture of civility in place before you roll out a plan or implement the change. And this is how civility as a continuous improvement strategy is different. Now, civility happens before any event happens, which I mentioned, and it becomes part of the everyday experience. And civility fosters change readiness. And when an event does happen, employees are more trusting, they believe in their team and leadership, and they adapt to change more easily. So we want change readiness so we can solve problems easier. And they are resilient, and the people work better, and they work better together. Some of the ways civility happens before an event is shown in the before box on the chart up above. And civility is written right into the mission statements. Civility is written right into communication protocols and codes of conduct. In this way, civility is already part of the everyday habit, and employees exhibit and practice it ongoing before an event happens. And if you have competent supervisors and trained in civility, when they are delivering SOPs or instructions or giving directions, their interactions with operators are civil from the beginning. They anticipate fears and challenges. They do what they can to make the employee comfortable, and this builds trust. The trust carries over when things are difficult or a challenge arises. They ask, excuse me, they ask questions, they engage in communication, they are open to feedback, they trust leadership. So even before an individual is on the job, the relationship is more positive. We've already eased the operator's experience. So now when we check on production or give feedback, this is the during box, even when we say hello or just observe, people are more relaxed. They perceive us as trustworthy and credible. There's less stress and less incivility. People tend to exhibit the treatment they experience. So I want to say civility is preemptive to resolving problems, and it is ongoing and day to day. It is continuous improvement of your continuous improvement strategies. And I want you to consider civility as a preventative measure that offsets the people problems that inhibit traditional continuous improvement approaches. And through civility, we build relationships, and this prevents sabotage, withholding information, a non-team oriented behavior, and other civil behaviors. So I want to talk about, let's look at the chart and let's look at the before. So I'll give more explanation of what I just talked about, and I want to give a real life experience of what you would experience in manufacturing. So if you look at the before, and this is before a problem even arises, and this is how we build the relationship and trust with the people we're working with. So if you look at before, we mentioned that we would have competent supervisors. So they would be trained in civility. And I would tell my supervisors or the people I'm managing that when you give instruction, I want you to recognize the experience of the people that you're delivering the information to. So let's look at a person new on a job or a new employee, and they're giving a standard operating procedure. So my experience, and I hope that you have similar experiences, or maybe you don't, which is even better. But when you give someone a standard operating procedure, it's a list of instructions of what they're to do. So my experience is it's a very tense time for that employee because if they're new, they're trying to pay attention to what is being asked of them. And if they're an experienced operator, they know that this can be used as a form of discipline, and it has been in the past because they've seen it. So we want to relay that information in a civil way. We want to ask them questions. And I talk about feedback. I can show you how to do, there's other information of how to give proper feedback by observations. And that's another topic of making quantitative data by qualitative observations. And that's reading body language and sensing the experience of who you're talking to. So you've already started to build that trust relationship before the person even starts the jobs. So during, which is the next box, we're going to maintain that relationship, and we're going to build more rapport by making observations and periodic observations, and we're going to give feedback and build that relationship. And during that time, we're going to tell them the things they're doing well and the things they need to improve on. And at the same time, we're asking them, do they need tooling? Do they need more training? And then that freedom of information is what you really need to solve problems. And that freedom of information, they're going to tell you, yes, this tool should be a little more, should be closer to my workstation, or this should be a little closer, or how about why can't we move this? So that back and forth is building that relationship, and that's you're developing your culture. So these problems are, I'm going to mention low-hanging fruit. So a lot of continuous improvement projects start out resolving the problems that could have been resolved with a culture of civility before, because that back and forth during your feedback, those problems have already been considered because everyone is willing to talk about information and give up that knowledge that everyone has. So that's the preemptive part of civility as far as continuous improvement. It resolves problems before they happen, so you can focus on the big problems. So implementing civility resolves all the low-hanging fruit that I mentioned, and that is problems that would typically arise but won't, because there's that trust and engagement that happened before the event. So this is how civility is used concurrent with your other continuous improvement strategies, and makes for a more robust and complete solution. Lou, we're going to talk about the culture continuum. Remember when I said there are two things I wanted to take away from this presentation? And this is the second one. I'm going to share with you what we believe is a tool that can significantly change manufacturing workplace. And it's called the Culture Indicator Continuum. We provided each of you with a copy, which will be loaded in your chat box. Now, the continuum helps you use observable and quantitative data collection related to workplace behavior. And this continuum helps you use observable and quantitative data collection related to workplace behavior. So I mentioned before, defining culture was difficult because it's when you say that you want to improve culture, it's a qualitative observation. It's not using data. So What we're doing now is we're using qualitative observations and turning that into data so we can define a problem, and then we can show where we are and where we're going. So when we improve, we can show our improvement, and we can show that we have improved culture. So we will use this information to identify where individuals sit on a continuum of civility. And this information is the how you need to actually change. So one of the difficulties of changing culture is, do you attack the whole work environment, and how do you make that change? So we break it down to the finest point, right down to the individuals in your workplace, and then we use that data to make improvements. So remember, we talked about how difficult it is to change culture because we're taking qualitative observations in an attempt to make a quantitative evaluation of culture. Well, this continuum here quantifies behavior. So it measures the daily experience, it measures level of accountability and engagement, and it tells you as leaders what to do, what to look for, how to interpret what you see, how to change the conditions so that you can see something different, and what skills you need to do to teach to do that. So how do we solve any problem? We need to define the problem. So in this case, the problem is culture. And remember, culture is an individual's experience. So how a person behaves indicates his or her experience. And when we observe and categorize behavior, we can use this as an indicator of culture. And again, I'm going to use something familiar with manufacturing, which is a DMAIC, D-M-A-I-C, problem-solving method. If you're not familiar with it, I'll go through it. And if you are, I will refresh you. So we have defined the problem. D is culture. The next step is to measure it, which is M in the DMAIC. And we use the continuum to get a quantitative value of where you currently are on the continuum. Next step is A, or act. So we put a plan in place. Our plan should include information about the current situation, the situation during the plan, and the resulting information after the plan has been implemented so we can show improvement. For example, our plan includes that civility is embedded. Let's start with the hiring process and the communication protocols and the codes of conduct, and including how you give feedback and how you treat people every day. Also, protocols for how to manage communication during times of crisis or change. And finally, how to repair miscommunication or give credit and accolades after an event is resolved. Moving along with our DMAIC approach, the I is improve. It's about getting and putting processes in place once the root cause is found. And using the continuum, you would identify people or sort them into each behavior category, and then outline a process, which might include communication or feedback or training, to move them to the next level. And we do have a comprehensive approach for giving feedback, which I mentioned before, based on observation and doing so with civility. This is available in the various resources, which will also be in the chat box. Lastly, C is control or edit, which is reviewing the process. And continuous improvement, we make the process, and then we review the process again to see if we can make any more improvements. And the purpose of this step is to embed the change and ensure sustainability. This is sometimes referring to making the change stick. And control is the final stage of the DMAIC approach. You can continually amend or update or learn new ways of working, and in this case of civility, new ways of treating people. If managers and supervisors are trained to identify the stage their team members are at, and if they can be taught what the cause and fixes are to move people along the continuum, they can change the day-to-day experience of people and accordingly change your culture. I'll give another personal experience. So what I discovered was that in my own work, I was using the same approach. And this is when I first became a supervisor. I was using the same approach, but I was taking a long time for me to categorize the behavior and conditions and to build trust with people. I'll give you an example. So when I was training supervisors, I always say it takes 6 months for everyone to get used to you if you're new. And during that time, you have to maintain your character, be honest, tell the truth, and then eventually everyone will begin to recognize your character. And I felt that could be improved. So I was a new supervisor at Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, and I was new to the people I was managing. I said, and I was also new to the environment. I worked in manufacturing, and now I was working in the sports industry for events. I said hello to one employee every day for 6 months before he acknowledged me or even lifted his head. And after 6 months, he finally looked up and started responding to me with hello. And I want to say that this person was a team leader. He was very valuable to the company. He had tons of knowledge, and he needed to be moved up the continuum so we could have him more engaged and have him contribute more and share some of that knowledge. I call it tribal knowledge, where a lot of people have that information, but they don't reveal it all. And in this experience, it was because he was getting a new supervisor every 6 months. So he would volunteer the information, and then it would be gone because the next person either got promoted or moved to a different department. So he just stopped giving that information. So I would put this person in the withdrawal stage in the behavior category because of his body language and the way he was reacting. And if I had this tool at the time, I would have been able to identify more quickly where he was and what were the indicators of why he was acting that way, or his experience from leadership that led him to be in the withdrawal stage. And I would have been able to identify it more quickly. I would have been able to quickly determine his behavior based on indicators, identify the possible causes of his behavior, figure out what was contributing to his behavior based on his experience, and I would have been able to know what skills I needed to change his behavior that I needed. So in my experience, I've learned that I can't control an employee's life stresses or his home stresses, but what I can impact is his or her experience at work. So that became my goal. And I treated my job as, yes, I had things to accomplish, but my main goal was to ease the experience of the people I work with, because with that, problems become easier to solve and work can be fun, because fun is work can be a fun place to work. So I had a good process for people treatment, but I needed to do it quicker. And it wasn't until I spoke with Lou that I was able to put this process on paper and explain it in a way others could benefit from what I was doing and having success with. So remember, the goal of all continuous improvement projects is, and I've mentioned a few more times, when something works and you have success, can it be applied to other departments or other areas of work? Using the data in the way we did with the Continuum, it's a continuous improvement on this process. So based on my collaboration with Lou and civility experts, we are now able to give you a standardized operating procedure for changing culture. So if you have a difficulty defining culture and difficulty improving culture, our goal is to give you a standard operating procedure to do that. And I'm going to ask Lou to give a bit more instruction on how to use this tool.
Perfect. Thank you, Christian. So if you had an opportunity to download or to print the Culture Indicator Continuum Brief, it's 3 or 4 pages of notes about this tool that we provided with you before the conference started. Otherwise, there is a copy Pam can load into the chat box for you. I want to, before I get into this, explain as well that you can use this tool without really knowing what civility is. You don't actually have to have a conversation with your leadership or supervisors, managers, whoever will be using the tool to still use it and benefit from it. And it is something that we've used in other industries and sectors, but find works particularly well in manufacturing because there's quite a bit of observation and interaction typically between supervisors and managers and the production team. So just looking at the graphic for a moment, this particular tool measures overall accountability and engagement. You see those on the axes listed there. And what we've done is building on our 25 years of field work, extensive research, review of the research in NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming, working with social psychologists and our motivation professionals, we've identified 10 categories of behavior and determined that almost every nonverbal, verbal, tonal, contextual cue that we might observe in the workplace will fit into one of these 10 categories. And they are written in a leveling way, a scaffolding way, such that the most negative, the least accountable, the least engaged employee would typically score in the lower, the bottom left quadrant of the chart. So withdrawal, for example, being an indicator of low engagement, low accountability, all the way up the ladder to contribution. And employees who are contributing in a positive way are fully engaged and fully accountable. So what we would encourage people to do is through observation, you're going to use your social acuity, your social intelligence, and this is why we encourage leaders and managers, everyone on the leadership team to be trained such that they have high social acuity, and we can help you with that. But what you would do is through observation, you're going to monitor and track, document the behaviors that you observe for each individual on the team. So if you have printed out that handout, if you turn to page 4, you'll see that we have devised for you this chart. We've done most of the heavy lifting for you. So just reviewing the chart, the outermost left column is the state or behavior, and those 10 categories of behavior are listed there. So the way the tool works is that you would, in a separate document or with some checklists, and we do provide some of those checklists in our toolkit, you would watch for behaviors. And so, for example, if Christian's on the floor and he's monitoring his team and he observes a particular employee who is kind of avoiding eye contact, calling in sick frequently, giving the silent treatment maybe to management or to team members, maybe not performing to the extent we expect, disengaging from optional or social activities. There's some indicators listed there. What we would want to do is to observe that employee over a series of interactions. So clearly the human condition applies at work. Sometimes people just have a bad day, and we can't interpret someone's avoiding eye contact concurrent with backing away physically or emotionally as withdrawal necessarily unless we observe that behavior consistently or more regularly. And so you would want to monitor or observe over a series of interactions, a series of different shifts or times of day, and so on. And it takes a little bit of work initially, but once a management member of the team, a supervisor, for example, has developed high social intelligence, particularly social acuity and social radar, this ability to be present and interpret accurately verbal, nonverbal, tonal, and contextual cues, he or she will find that almost instantly they can assess behavior. So once we've categorized someone, let's take, for example, an employee that we've observed behaviors on a regular basis that we feel fit into this withdrawal category. Then we're going to look at the third column in the chart, and we're going to ask ourselves, what are the possible causes for the state or behavior in that individual? And this column relates to causal factors or aspects that the individual potentially has control over. So maybe we determine that that individual has an anger problem, and so he or she can in fact exert a little more control over the behavior than maybe they're doing. If that is determined to be the cause and we deem that the individual is responsible for that, then we're probably going to assign that individual some anger management training. Maybe we're going to teach them some social IQ or systems thinking so that they understand how their behavior impacts the work team, bigger picture, but we're going to hold them accountable and put them through some individual training. If, on the other hand, we determine that the individual is pretty good-natured, pretty confident, that they're not sick, that there's no cause for depression, or we can't explain from a personal or individual point of view why the withdrawal behaviors are happening, then we would look at column 4 and try to determine whether or not there is a causal factor or an influencing factor that we as the organization or leadership can control. So does it have more to do with the supervisor or the manager, the leadership that this individual is interacting with? It could in fact take, for example, somebody on a management team. Is that person maybe ignoring the employee? Are they leading by fear? Are there aspects of the workplace culture that we have not monitored or controlled appropriately? For example, we call them Maslow's hierarchy needs. Maybe the individual doesn't feel safe, so he's withdrawing because repeated requests for an environment to be made safe have been ignored or disregarded, those kind of things. If we determine that it is in fact the leadership that is contributing to this behavior or co-creating an environment where the behavior can exist, then we're going to try to address the individuals responsible for that. So this might mean that we have to take a supervisor and teach that supervisor social intelligence, teach that supervisor some respect and some core leadership aspects of social competence. So this might include communication skills, for example. And when we're trying to determine which skill gain will offset the negative behavior, we've done, based on our research, provided for you rather a list of that in the 5th column. So we know, for example, that when withdrawal happens, the majority of the time it relates to these personal safety and psychological safety needs. So we would provide management, supervisors on the floor, for example, with additional information or training so that they can address those Maslow's hierarchy needs, safety, psychological and otherwise. We might teach self-management basics. That's restraint and how to convey respect. And just so that you know, these civility training solutions do not have to be lengthy or labor-intensive. We have, for example, provided in the Social Competence for Manufacturing Supervisors book, and you can email events@civilityexperts.com, and I'm happy to send you these lists. We call them the Masadi methods. There are 10 common sense communication strategies that we would teach management team that is impacting the workplace culture. And for example, one of those relates to tone. Sometimes people are completely oblivious to their tone, and that means the physical demeanor combined with the way their voice and word choice, the way their communication style is coming across. I've often heard people say, you need to adjust your tone, or your tone is harsh, but we never take the time to teach people how to adjust it, or what are the specific elements of tone that we can adjust. And so, again, we've done that work for you. We have, through our research and with support with our social psychologists and NLP experts on our team, as well as our civility team, come up with lists, checklists that you can use pretty quickly in lieu of time-consuming or costly training, and have some immediate shift in behavior and some immediate impact. So I know that there's quite a bit to take in, but what I would say again is, with 20 minutes or 30-minute review of the chart, you can, even without knowing what a leadership team member's overall social intelligence or level of social acuity is, provide these checklists of nonverbal and verbal cues and ask them to just observe them, and then come back and chart them and sort them so that each employee can fit into these categories. And it's a good idea to consider that everyone on the leadership team also chart themselves, be monitored and track their own nonverbal cues and behaviors such that they can find out which level of the continuum they sit on too. I'm going to stop talking for a minute here and pass this back to Christian so that he can share with you a little bit more of his first-hand field experience related to these tools.
Okay, thank you, Lou. So if you work for a company or own a company and you are struggling with how to change culture, I hope you look at our resources and tools and ideas and contact us with questions. And there's two key things to remember. And do you remember what they are? The first thing is we need to define culture. We cannot fix the problem of culture if we don't know what it is, and we need to define it. Culture is the day-to-day experience of people living in the organization. So to change culture, you have to change the day-to-day experience. You do that by changing how you treat people. What I want you to do, and here's your challenge, your take-home from the presentation. What I want you to do at your next pre-shift or morning meeting, along with talking about your production goals, I challenge you to end every meeting by telling people to go out and, instead of changing culture, to go out and ease the experience of the co-workers and make this commitment to yourself as well and see what happens. So there's your opportunity that you're delivering an SOP, you're giving an instruction, and you're telling people to go ease the experience of people. So how would your people react? Do they see themselves as a service to the people that are working around them and for them? And do they see that easing their experience is important? So I want you to make your own observations when you deliver that information. And I want you to categorize the people on this culture indicator continuum. So yes, your responsibilities are keeping people safe. And yes, making quality products and meeting production goals. But I want you to consider the experience of the people you are directing and instructing while you are interacting with them. And remember, if you are in a leadership role and you play a critical part in determining the day-to-day experience of your team. So you need to be accountable yourself. And I'd like you to put yourself on the culture indicator continuum and see where you are based on the characteristics and indicators that Lou mentioned, and see where you are in the continuum and how you're leading your people as far as changing culture. The second thing I want you to remember is to be open-minded and try civility as a continuous improvement strategy alongside your current continuous improvement approaches, because civility solves people problems. And remember, that is the hard part to quantify, and that's the hard part to explain at the end of every day, the people problems and why you lost production or why things happen. So we talked about people on the floor and the supervisors and what they need to do. And the great thing about an effective continuous improvement project is that it can be applied to other departments. Remember we talked about that? If something works somewhere, can that be applied somewhere else? So this approach is also applicable to not only, we broke it down right down to the people on the floor making the product and the supervisors. So this is also applicable the other way to the extreme. So this is applicable to the C-suite employees, to the board of directors, and to the executives, to the plant managers and the production managers. And I encourage you to move the strategy up the ladder. So I challenge you to assess yourself on the continuum, as I mentioned. And it is not reasonable to expect others to be accountable and engaged and contributing positively if you are not doing the same. So we do have time to take some questions if anyone would like. We will ask for our moderator to step in, and thank you for your attention so far.
Great, thanks, Christian. Fantastic presentation so far. We do have some questions that have come directly to me. I'll ask the first one here is, what is the most common question that you get about civility, specifically in manufacturing or just in general?
Lou, can you do you want to ask, or Lou, could you just answer in general about civility? Because in manufacturing, it hasn't come up, and I'm introducing it. And so I'm taking Lou's work and applying it to manufacturing. So I'll let Lou talk about civility in general.
Sure. So I can tell you that the most frequent question we get is, how can you prove this to me? We talked a little bit about the definition of civility, that people really don't understand that it's a measurable competency, that they think it's about being nice or being kind. Don't wear white after Labor Day or Martha Stewart perfection. They don't understand, particularly in industries like manufacturing, how it could possibly have an impact to the bottom line. But at the same time, people do recognize that there are indicators that people are unhappy. We frequently hear people are disengaged or retention is low. And those factors in our field work we find always relate to trust. And trust is often a result of a civil workplace. So when people feel that you value and respect them, they trust you and they perform better. In addition, there's all sorts of meaty research about the benefits. I mentioned some health issues, everything from creativity to innovation to team orientation. Problem solving is impacted when people feel happy and safe and like they can trust their employer, their coworkers, and their leadership. So we know that there's a solid business case for civility, and I believe that's Chapter 4. There's all kinds of statistics and research to back up that claim. It's Chapter 4 in the 30% Solution book that we've provided you a complimentary copy, PDF copy, in the chat box. But for manufacturing, the reason I reached out to Christian, because I needed somebody who had experience in the field, was because the manufacturing companies that I was working in, although they started to understand the value of civility, they couldn't understand how it would relate to their KPIs and their metrics. And so part of the challenge was speaking the language of the workplace. And of course, I didn't grow up in manufacturing, so a lot of that day-to-day, how do you roll out civil communications in an SOP, some of that I came to understand pretty quickly that it didn't matter how much I knew about civility. If I didn't know anything about manufacturing, it would be pretty hard to link the dots. So the most common question was, how can you use this in manufacturing without any manufacturing experience? And that's where Christian came in. And he was able to highlight for me not only the return on character, we call that the ROC, but also the ROI, the immediate measurable cost to profitability in the bottom line, to safety, which is critical, but also to morale, to the reputation of the organization, to social capital, because many manufacturing organizations have close ties to the community, and when they treat their people badly, that lowers social capital and their reputation. So that's a long answer to a short question, but I think the most common issue is, what does this have to do with manufacturing? How can you possibly get it? You've never worked in our field.
I think you explained that extremely well, and as someone who has read the book, Manufacturing Civility, you do a very good job of capturing the industry. So that may have been where you were, but that's not where you are today. So well done. Another question is, how would you describe a competence in civility on a resume or on in an interview?
I can answer that, and then Christian can probably add in a little bit. Generally, we would tell people to avoid using the word civility because many people don't really understand what it is, and instead focus on the skills. So you could highlight your social intelligence. You could talk about how you have the ability to adapt your social style, that you have high success interpreting verbal, nonverbal, and tonal cues. You could reference that you are keenly aware of the written and the unwritten rules, which relates to social knowledge and social IQ. You could say that you scored high on social acuity assessments. You could reference that you're a continuous learner, that you have high cultural competence, and we can detail some of those aspects. It's a kind of a topic in and of itself. And you could talk about how you perceive yourself to be a systems thinker, that you understand the impact of your words and thoughts and actions and beliefs on the systems that you work in and with. I think it's good advice to highlight the skills and avoid the use of the word civility. And I'm sure Christian could allude to some of the team building, or how many people sign on to be moved to your shift if you're the supervisor, those kind of things.
Well, yeah, that's my experience. That I keep trying to give examples of specifics in manufacturing, and that shift-to-shift difference, and where people work. If you have a unionized shop where people can bid on jobs and choose jobs. So as a manager, you'll find, why do certain groups have a strong workforce and actually produce more? And then you look at the supervisor and the way he handles or she handles himself, and you'll probably find. So what I found was, so supervisors are in a high stress area, let's say like auto manufacturing, you're trying to control so many things at one time. And I found that the people that are very good and have social intelligence, they focus on the people, and they spend all their time with that relationship and back and forth. And then I find that the people that were struggling with social intelligence, and that I always wished that there was training for them, and that's why we came up with this, because they tend to focus on what they can control. So if you're not great at social intelligence and building that relationship and solving problems by having all these conversations and rapport with everyone, then they would focus on the administrative part. So it's just an observation that you have to keep making observations on what you see. So I still see it today that supervisors and managers with low social intelligence or don't have that back and forth feedback on the floor, that they focus on what they can't control. So some people will be very administrative. Here's an example: safety talk, get people to sign on this. Those people get that done quick. And then the other social intelligence people, it may take them a little longer because they're actually interacting with those. They're not just saying, here, sign this, or let's review your JSA or standard operating procedure, and I need you to sign this. So they get that done real quick. Whereas a social intelligent, someone with high social intelligence, it takes them longer because they're choosing to have that as an opportunity to build that relationship. So I see those differences.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that answer. Now, I have two other questions here. One of them is, can you give an example of when you use civility to de-escalate a conflict? Not that there's ever conflict in manufacturing, but in case there ever was, how would you use it to de-escalate?
Lou, did you want to? Okay, so my experience of de-escalating conflict, which happens on the, I'm sure everyone's experienced that on the floor. So this is why we talked about civility and changing the culture, because it's that low-hanging fruit that I mentioned before. So that problem of conflict shouldn't happen, because we've already created that right from day one. So we've trained our supervisors and management in civility. So they're trained. When they go out, they talk to even better when they're onboarding people, and they start right away with that level of civility and that interaction and feedback and observing how people are taking information. So we try to reduce that conflict before it even starts, and that's why civility is a continuous improvement problem or solution on continuous improvement. So I try to prevent that. But just, do you mean like a one-on-one conversation? I talk about in my books where there's a good time to give feedback and information, and it's the same with conflict. There's a good time to deliver information and realize where the person is and what's just happened. So, I mean, you need to, it's all, for me, it's all preemptive. So I talk about in the book building a character. So if you present yourself as a calm person who lets people speak, and waits for them to finish. Sometimes I even say, go ahead, tell me what's happening. And then I let them speak. And then I always say, okay, do you want to say more, or are you finished talking? And then I will speak back and forth. So I let them get it all out, and then you can go back and forth. And then you have to remain calm and build that character, but you have to present that character long before that problem occurred. And that's why it's preemptive, and it's a preventative measure to solving conflict. And that's it.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. It's like an investment in your future, really, is what you're talking about. So I have a union question. As someone who worked in the steel industry for a long time, how does this work with a union? And have you seen shifts in attitude or animosity, or how does this work in a unionized environment, please?
So again, I'm in the steel industry, and I worked at I don't know if I'm allowed to mention, it's ArcelorMittal. So there's a difference between some are non-unionized and some are unionized. And so it's the same thing that you see. So there used to being that when I was training people, I always used to say, use your union as a resource. And we used to call them a business partner, right? So they work hand in hand with you. And when you give them, again, you're giving the union the respect, because I explain, when you're working and you're new to an environment, you're managing 70 people, let's say. There's no way, even if you've been in the industry and even if you started on the floor and you're now the plant manager, you still don't know all the intricacies of the jobs that people have been doing forever, because there's no way you can know 70 positions on the assembly floor or in the steel mill as well as the people that are doing the job currently. So you need to acknowledge that, for one, the union represents these people, and the union members are the experts on their job. They know more about their specific job. If they've been doing it 5, 10, 20 years, they know that job better than you do. So you need to respect that and build that relationship with the union as a resource. So that's what I do. I use the union as a resource. I think you develop a good relationship, again, with civility right off the bat. Introduce yourself, have a good relationship with everyone, and you will solve problems quicker, because they do want the place to stay open. They do want a future. They do want the 30 years to stay there and retire. They don't want it to close. And you have to realize that. So use them as a resource and build a good relationship with them. And that's how I do it. And that's how I train people to work in it.
And if it's all right, I'd just like to add a comment to that, because I think some people, Christian's mentioned several times about some of these processes. We have Masadi methods, these feedback methods, and so on. But as a preemptive measure, one way that kind of relates to this question, that we would incorporate civility into the best practices, is to have in our code of conduct and our communication protocol statements and guidelines to help people understand the impact of incivility. So, for example, we would teach employees, or it's embedded in the communication protocol, that they are going to be held accountable for the impact of their communication. So the intention doesn't matter so much. What I wanted or wished or dreamed or imagined or felt or hoped would happen after I said whatever I said is not terribly relevant. I'm actually going to be held accountable for the outcome. And when you teach people that, when it's embedded in communication protocol, this philosophy, people tend to pause and practice a little restraint before they speak, because they know that they can't just say, oh, you know what I mean, or I didn't mean that, or you're overreacting, or, you know, they have to take responsibility for it. So it changes how people interact, and you know, it's sort of this intention and deliberation and pause. And if they learn that from the beginning, they engage that way even in times of high stress or crises, because they know that other people are going to exercise the same restraint and show them the same respect and so on. So it is something that, to Christian's point, we can offset or preempt difficult conversations, escalating issues related to interpersonal relationships, crisis conversations, and so on, if we teach people how to communicate, engage in civil dialogue, ask questions in a timely way, read cues so that you know when to back down instead of push forward. Those kind of social aspects that oftentimes are overlooked, particularly in manufacturing, where often people are promoted from the floor, right? So because they did their job well technically, then they're suddenly the primary piece of their job is people as opposed to process, and they were never given those people skills. So this is what civility does, is it helps to support the development of those.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We have one last question before we are finished for today from the audience that says, some people are just not that motivated in general. In speaking with regards to civility and people, how do we change that? Do we change that? What are your thoughts on that with regards to connection between motivation and civility?
Well, I can speak specifically to, because you have to find what motivates people. And if you're in management and you're a supervisor, and let's say you don't need that, you don't want that civil approach, or what I found was the people that didn't want to do that actually didn't know how to do it. So if we could teach them of how to be civil, and then the benefits of doing that is, it's easing your experience at work. So when I'm training supervisors and managers, the benefit of being civil is it actually makes your job easier. So your job is to problem solve. And then the best way to problem solve is create an environment where problems can be solved easily. And you have to do that by creating readiness, so people will volunteer that information. That's the hardest thing about solving a problem is, here's what I found. I used to tell people all the time. I said, everyone, like I said before, the people with all the experience on the job, they've been doing it 5, 10, 20 years, they know exactly what's wrong, and they know exactly how to fix it. And either they've tried to fix it or given the information and nobody followed through with it, or they have the turnover of supervisors and they just stopped giving that information. So when they find that you are interested in making their work life easier, then they start to volunteer that information, and then you start to problem solve, and you start to, so it's, your performance improves because of civility. And if you have to sell it that way to somebody, to kind of force somebody to realize that their day is going to be easier, then I've done that too. And then over time, they do see that relationship happens. And the best thing is, so it's easy if someone new is coming in, you can start right off the hop. This is your character. You're calm. You're civil. You respect people's experience. You're trying to help. But let's say you've been there 15, 20 years and you have that fear and demand, which, I'm sure we're all accustomed to someone who rules by that. I mean, the best thing about it is if you decide to change the experience of people that you work with, and you were a certain way after 20 years, and now all of a sudden you're letting people have a conversation with you and giving that feedback, and you're implementing things. I mean, they see a huge what more of a difference is someone who just started and say, oh, that's just the way he is. we like working for him. Or, man, what's happened to David in the last 2 weeks? The guy's totally different. He's, so if you have that dramatic change from being a, direct, strict manager and supervisor, and then you flip to trying to improve civility and culture, that's even more noticeable. So that's a huge benefit.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Christian and Lou. I'd like how you connected civility to continuous improvement to the culture.